Welcome everyone. Okay, welcome everyone. And today I will be presenting this paper. Is this zTT learning-based DVFS with zero thermal throttling for mobile devices. So let's take a look at the outline here. First is the motivation for why the purpose for this paper, and then we'll be introducing this learning-based DVFS more thoroughly. Next, we will be running some implementation with the paper provide, and we will see the results together, and finally we can reach our conclusion for this paper. So more and more high performance tasks are ran on mobile devices. For example, you can think of some high quality mobile games. For example, like some race cars or like fighting action games. Yeah, and multitask apps that are installed in your devices, or more 5G chipset. Of all those are very high performance tasks that requires better operation of those mobile devices. So here are the examples of what I've just mentioned above. So what is the main problem of those mobile devices is that two problems. First is about overheating. That if you, let's say if you play a game and when at some moment the cell phone starts to overheat and starts to burn, feels like it's burning, that could be an issue. And the second one is the power consumption, as in when you're using Skype or other things and to talk with your family, and then the cell phone turn off because it's out of power. So these two are the main problems for current mobile devices. So the first solution to power consumption is introduce DVFS, which is as in dynamic voltage frequency scaling. Basically, it means it adjusts the CPU or GPU voltage frequency to reduce the power consumption. And the solution to overheat, here they provided the thermal throttling. So what it does is that it lowers the performance when the temperature meets a predefined threshold. When the server is about to overheat, they will turn down, as in like the frame rate or some other performances to lower the temperature. So these are the two solutions to both power and overheat. But and here's the picture of the how thermal throttling works. But there are also limitations to those techniques. The first one, problems with DVFS, is that it is inefficient due to independent governor. So it means that if you use the CPU or GPU, they are actually separated governors to take control whether the frequency should be high or low. So if you don't know what the application is doing, you might have some inefficiency due to you have too high of the CPU frequency, or you have like too high of GPU frequency. And problems with thermal throttling is that what if you have a dynamic changing in environment and the inside performance? So as an environment, that is, if you're taking your cell phone outdoors and it's really hot out there, and you go into a room and it's the AC is turned on, so the dynamic environmental change could have some problems. And inside performance as well is that different applications, they have different performance or frame rates needed. So these are the two limitations to DVFS and thermal throttling. So now we are done with the motivation. We will be introducing the zTT, learning-based DVFS. So zTT as it refers to zero thermal throttling. The approach here is first, we learn the environment and application performance. So there are two. First is the outside environment and the inside application. After learning those, we can predict the future temperature, or we can predict the future application performances of the device. And then after learning and we have the prediction, we can then optimize power consumption, and while we can prevent the device from reaching its thermal threshold. So here's a picture of showing how different applications work. So on the y-axis is the CPU clock frequency, and the x-axis is the GPU. And there are two types of application. First is application A, as in CPU intensive, and application B, as in GPU intensive. So there are different purposes for both applications. And there are, as a warmer environment, as in the graph, the warmer environment, usually they have lower frequencies because they cannot reach too high, and that makes the temperature be too high. And if you're in a cooler environment, the CPU and GPU frequency, they can afford to go a bit higher than usual. So the difference between application A and B, those are the application learning. And the difference between cooler, warmer, this is the environment learning. So there are two types of learnings in this graph. So here's the design. We first have a reward RT, as in equals to the equation in the right. And I will be telling about those different parameters. So first one is the UT, as in utility function. And most of it represents the user quality of experience, and which we will be defining those later in the slides. And PT as the total power consumption. Here, total power consumption means that it contains CPU power consumption and GPU power consumption and other additional power consumptions. WT as the thermal constant, as in it has something to do with temperature, which we'll be having a definition later as well. And beta as the trade-off term. So if today you don't care about the power consumption, you can set the beta to 0. But if you are you really concern a lot about the power consumption, you can set beta real high, as it affects enormously on the reward. So here are the two functions that I think needs to be mentioned. So UT, utility function, is to the graph below, and XT we would define it as the frame rate, because frame rate is mostly even to define what a performance is. So if the frame rate is high, that means it's good. And here is like the graph shows that if it reaches a certain amount of frame rate, then it's satisfied. So you're good with that. So the amount stays at 1. As for the W, and is the equation in the right. So as if the temperature, the processor's temperature reached a specific defined temperature, and the W will drop dramatically. So it really affects on the reward if you exceeded the temperature. And to get to more details, this is based on a Markov decision process, whereas
sorry, could you go to previous page?
Yes.
For this one, the UT I can understand, but for the WCT, where the 10 comes from, the negative 10?
The 10 is like a predefined. Say if you want the thermal constraints to be more effectively, you can set it higher. As in, if you exceed it, it would drop as this amount. Pretty much, you would define the lambda as how you care about the temperature. So it's like beta and trade-off term in the power consumption.
So the value 10 is arbitrarily chosen, right? Or yeah. We can choose like 8 or 9 or whatever, 100.
I think 10 is better because like it's more intuitive. Because what really matters is the lambda, right? If you change the lambda to if you set it to like 0.1 or 0.5, that makes a difference. And 10 is just a better way to create the gap between a good temperature and a bad temperature.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just trying to say, is this 10 chosen by empirical results, or is it just randomly arbitrarily chosen?
I would say it's just randomly chosen, and it's more intuitive. In a way.
No, but I think the reward should be very sensitive to this number. For example, if we set it as 100, even lambda is 0.1, I think the reward value will become very small because WC is negative.
Yeah, could you go to previous page, Huai-an, for the reward function?
Here, is it this one?
Yeah, from this you can see. So I think this reward should be very sensitive to this number.
Yeah, exactly. Just in case, right? So if we have WT to be a negative value, we have some, we go beyond the threshold, the temperature threshold, whatever, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this kind of deep reinforcement learning is not one iteration things, right? So it's run over multiple iterations, right? Like Dr. Yuan like Dr. Yuan mentioned, if you choose that number to be very large, say negative 100, I mean, future iteration probably cannot compensate this kind of loss, right? So that value seems a little bit weird. I don't know, is empirically chosen or is arbitrarily chosen? Can it be 8 or be 9? Is there any kind of difference? Or just like Dr. Yuan and I mentioned, can it be negative 100, negative 1, negative 0.1? Right. So I know this is a very experimental based paper, but still I feel it's a little bit weird to choose a specific number 10. I mean, if in your simulation you choose an arbitrary number to show the effectiveness of your schema, I think that's fine. But if when you define your reward function and WT function, stuff like that, you choose a specific number, it sounds weird.
Okay.
What do you think, Dr. Yuan?
Yeah, I think probably in the paper, I'm not sure they should mention something about this. At least they should say like the empirical experience things. Otherwise, I don't think it can be arbitrarily to set as 10.
Yeah. Huai-an, please double check that. Okay, it's MobiSys best paper.
Yeah.
Although it's not a theoretical paper, but still.
If he cannot argue this number, I believe the review will change that it's very hard to go to the best paper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Please move on, Huai-an. Thank you.
All right. So now we're back to Markov decision process. So, and there are three kinds of important informations here. The first is the state, and then is the action, and then is the reward we just mentioned 2 slides ago. And there are a lot of parameters here in the state section, so I will be going through. And the first two is the CPU or GPU frequency, and the second category are the temperature of CPU and GPU. The third are the power of CPU and GPU. And the last one, XT, refers to the frame rate. So these are all the states that are mentioned. And in action, we would change the frequency. So the only two parameters here are the FCT and FGT. So now we're here at the implementation, and we have a overview of how this all works. So take a look at step 1 is to take action here. By taking action, we use the greedy method, which is as in you would either go for exploration or you will do the exploitation of this. And then there's a cooldown action, as if the if the temperature is too high. So it is the box here in the zTT agent section as a cooldown action. So this is step 1. As for step 2, we will observe the state. We will observe the state of ST+1 after action AT. So there are all those states we've seen before. The first is the temperature, and there is power, and there is also frame rate. So step 2 is to just observe all these states. Third one is to collect the samples with the zTT agent. So they will collect ST and reward, the state, and the state after that, ST+1, and the action. And they will all collect these samples and then save them in the replay memory. And finally, they will do the random batch training through deep Q learning. So these are the 4 steps that is run under this implementation. They just keep going on. And with the constant changing of the environment, as it implies here, and as well as the application that might change in the device. And the implementation goes on with we will talk about the 2 devices we'll be using. So the first one is the Jetson TX2, which is on the left picture. And there is Pixel 3a, which is on the right picture. And there are 6 types of experimented applications here. And the first 3 are the Jetson TX2 device, and the other 3 are run under the Pixel 3a. So there are 6 of those, and we'll be talking about it now. So those applications, Jetson TX2, first is video rendering. So pretty much it just shows a video, and the video has changes of the frame rate, and you can see the frame rate changing and how the frame rate is at a current moment. The second one is YOLO, as it refers to object detection. So you can do by training, and you can tell whether the object is a dog, a bicycle, or a truck. And third one is the aquarium. So this is basically a website, and it basically is a website that contains like a lot of fish, and you can change the amount of fish in that website, and they will show you how the frame rate changes in there. So these are the applications with TX2. As in Pixel 3a, there are 3 other applications. So here first is the showroom VR. So they just show you around like how the room would look like if you want to rent a room. And second is the Skype. It's just a communication system we all know. And third one is a mobile game, which some people might play. Well, those three other applications we'll be going through.
Before you move further, Juan, could you tell us for those 6 applications, which one is more CPU intensive, which one is more GPU intensive?
So CPU, so GPU is to deal with the graphics. So
yeah, I believe the
Yeah.
author want to try, different applications, right? Some of them are CPU intensive, some of them
yes.
are GPU intensive. Yeah, we all know that GPU deals better with the graphical stuff, with videos, but we just want to know, which one is more CPU intensive among 6 of them.
Okay, so the paper doesn't really
Well, that's fine.
talk about the CPU
If
and
the paper
GPU.
didn't mention it, that's fine. I'm just curious. Okay, please move on.
Okay. So okay, now we are talking about the governors of those devices. So we're supposed to do a comparison of the new zTT DVFS and the older ones, older DVFS and the default from the Linux system or from the pre-installed type of governor that is in the devices. So here are those devices. The first one is Maestro. So it's basically a control-based DVFS. So it's without the new zero threshold, the zero thermal throttling and the learning part of it. And the second 2 of those are the components in Jetson TX2, and they relate to CPU and GPU. So these are the default of Jetson TX2. And as you might have guessed, the last 2 are those of the default of Pixel 3a. So these 3 are the things we'll be doing a comparison to and the implementation. So there are different ways to run this implementation. First is the learning the application quality of experience. So as we mentioned before, there are 2 types of learning. So first is environment and second is application. So here they emphasize on the application part. So they rule out the environmental effects. So they all be under the pretty much the same environment. So they conducted experiments in a heavily cooled environment. And I would say that just means the AC room. Yeah. And the second one is learning static environments with Pixel 3a. And with Pixel 3a, that means that the environment is not changing, but you can still learn it from those specific environments. So in Pixel 3a is a mobile device. So there are 4 different environmental settings mentioned in the paper. There are normal, they are under a fan, and they are put in your pocket, or the cell phone has their protective case. And as for TX2, here they only mention about the video rendering. And it's about learning it also is learning about static environments. So they are learning through a thermal headroom in this case. So this part is about static environments. And the next implementation is the changing environments. This one they provide with Jetson TX2, which is first is to do transfer learning to boost the adaptation speed. So because it takes a lot of time to do from 0 to fully training. So they do some transfer learning. And they use the sample copies to do faster convergence. And the device just in TX2 is under environmental changes. So it could be, it just changes constantly. It's in outdoors, and then it's warm or it's cold, whatever. And they will be showing how the results will go on. So first we will be looking at the learning application as in the first implementation. So here is the graph of showing the frame rate in the left and power consumption comparison of different applications. So they all set the target frame rate to a specific amount. To be more precise, query is 20, YOLO is 15, video rendering is 30. And the more you reach towards the 0 point, that means your performance is good. And as for power consumption, it's more intuitive. It's just the shorter is good, right? So here we can see that as in performance, zTT does overall better, although sometimes it loses some performances. But in power consumption, it's pretty obvious, like zTT is the best out of 3, out of Maestro and default. So this is the learning application.
Oh,
And the next is the,
before you move on,
yes.
previous page, please. Previous page. The Maestro, they do the proportional allocation between GPU and CPU. They do a fixed allocation, or they do the allocation based on different applications. For the blue one,
They do it. They do it on different applications.
say, for example, if there's one application like Aquarium, they allocated the CPU like 40% and GPU 60%. For YOLO, they do 50-50. For video rendering, probably they do 70-30, something like this.
Arshad, can you say about the?
I mean, I just want to take examples, right? So this kind of a dynamic proportional allocation, or it's kind of fixed allocation, fixed proportional allocation. Does that rely on the applications, or the allocation is rely on the applications or something? So just for example, right? So Aquarium, you give the CPU probably 40% and GPU 60%. For YOLO, just example, okay? Don't take this number seriously.
Okay.
For YOLO, is 50%, 50%. For video rendering, like 70%, 30%, something like this. They do the dynamic allocation.
They did not mention about the proportion of the CPU or GPU part. They didn't say that how much CPU is operated and how much GPU is. They basically focus on how the frame rate, the target frame rate they want to, and they focus on the power consumption. So I don't see they have a clear mentioning about how much rather CPU or GPU is. So that might follow the question of like, how are those, if those applications are CPU oriented or GPU orientated. They did not really say about this. Yeah.
But first of all, the reason why I ask is the question, because the Maestro's performance is close to zTT. That's the reason why I asked the question, right? The second thing, right, is you're the presenter of this paper. So probably you need to check around, the reference paper, the scheme they mention in the paper, right? I believe you read this paper for several times, but, because the performance is close, you're supposed to try to get some knowledge about the Maestro, right? It's a dynamic allocation, it's a fixed amount of allocation, right? Why is it so close? If Maestro is relatively much simpler, it's a game, right? Probably from my perspective, I think Maestro is better because it's more simple. zTT, you need to use a lot of deep reinforcement learning, this and that. You need to integrate some new design. why don't I follow some simple performance, relatively okay, not big difference scheme, right?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good point, and I would say that it depends on whether you care about the power consumption or not. So if you would say that training is takes time and it's a lot of effort, yeah, that's true. But if it can affect a long term, as in all the powers you'll be saving, as in if the device is very they demand a lot for power consumption, so then the zTT could be a better solution than Maestro.
Well,
Yeah, so I would say it depends on the
it's
cases.
very hard to argue that. If you check the Euro application, right? Maestro is better than zTT in terms of target frame rate. Also, Maestro is better than zTT for the aquarium application. Also, Maestro is better than zTT for video rendering, right? Yeah, it's consume a little bit more power, but performance is better, right? So you need a reason to justify why zTT is better than Maestro, right? For cell phone, right? Yeah, probably cell phone zTT is always outperform Maestro, but I believe for cell phone there are some other power consumption, right? So probably we don't know. It's not only the CPU, GPU, probably some other things. I mean, based on the experiments they have done, probably involve some baseband signal processing, power consumption, involving some other, RF amplification, RF control, power consumption. It's hard to justify that, right? So, but anyway, I just suggest you, right, try to figure it out, get a very clear idea what is the Maestro is. Then I don't know, probably you have a better explanation why we want to choose zTT here over the Maestro.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I also have the same concern. So just based on this power consumption performance, I think it's not a big deal. I think it's just better probably save like a 0.1 or 0.2 watt power. So it's not a big deal. I think so. Why this paper he can claim that he can beat this Maestro? Probably he has some other advantage. If just based on the performance, I don't think this performance is a big deal.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see for each of them, the performance is just marginally better than the Maestro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
For default, we understand it's definitely much better than the default one, but Maestro, I don't know in the literature because we are not a GPU, CPU, computer architecture guy. I don't know in the literature, is there a better implementation protocol than Maestro or not, right? So probably that's also the things you need to figure out afterwards. Okay.
Okay. So to answer those questions, I would say that first that I mentioned about the limitations for DVS for the Maestro is that first is about the power consumption, right? And the second is about the thermal throttling issue in many cases. Because zTT has the advantage of they have the learning section, so they can predict the environment, or they can predict the application. So then that means that thermal throttling would be much less of an issue. So that's why it is called zero thermal throttling. So I think zTT serves two different purposes. First is about power consumption, and if that feels minor, then
okay.
the second advantage is about.
Let me ask a follow-up question.
Okay.
Okay. So if we have thermal throttling,
Yeah.
what is the impact of that? What's the bad thing of this kind of thermal throttling? From my understanding, it's not a big deal. You just touch the upper bound, right? Then you're going down. You try to cool down. That's it. What's the big deal for that? again, we're not expert in this area, but I just try to, figure it out why the thermal throttling is a big deal. Well, if you can answer that, probably you need to do more homework.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you have one of the slides that's showing the thermal throw and the performance in the very, very beginning slides. Probably 2 or 3.
You can jump out and then move quickly to. You can exit the presentation mode. And
Okay.
then, yeah, move back. Oh, why is that? You exit the presentation. The whole PPT is gone.
You mentioned. Can you say that what is the information of the slide again?
We cannot see the slides.
The figure is like in the left hand you have the frame rate, and the right hand you have the temperature, and
Okay.
the x-axis is the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it this one?
No, it's not the design. I think it's more like you do the motivation part.
I think it's page number 3 or number 2. Page number 3, I believe.
Yeah.
Motivation.
When you talk about your first define thermal throttling, that page.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, is it here?
Oh, we cannot see the slide.
Is it this one?
Yes, it's this one. So you can see the so when the temperatures go up, like in the 100 times here, or 100 seconds here. So when the temperature is very high, you have to degrade your performance. Like you have to lower the frame rate to cool down the device, so that in this case the device or the application will run very slowly. In that case, you can cool down the devices. So this is the reason why we don't want this temperature to exist a predefined threshold. That in that way the performance will degrade.
So, okay, let me ask another question. So this is thermal throttling, right? So
Yeah.
this kind of things happen because of the, CPU, GPU, IC design, or it's because of, certain kind of physical phenomena. I mean, I can understand this, right? So if the GPU, CPU reach a probably upper bound of temperature, frequency is really high, you need to cool it down, right? So the corresponding frame rate is going to reduce. But yeah, if we don't reach small thermal throttling, right? So you just consider the real case. We don't reach the thermal throttling, but still, if the CPU and GPU always run at a relatively high frequency, but that's not reached to the upper bound, very high frequency, the CPU and GPU will get heated, right?
Yeah, it's because as the time
over time it's going to
very long.
Yeah,
it's gonna to achieve the high temperature, and in that case, you do not want the those CPU and GPU run in the temperature like that. So
the DG.
I understand what you're talking about, but the thing is, I want to ask is, okay, I don't know if because of the thermal throttling is kind of a mechanism for the IC design. So if you touch the thermal throttling or you touch the threshold, you need to cool down immediately. You have to cool down. There is a kind of mechanism, make you cool down immediately. Okay,
Yeah.
that is one case. Another case is, okay, if we don't touch this upper bound, but we keep the CPU and GPU working in the high frequency for a long time, do we need to cool down? Or we don't need to cool down?
No, we don't need to.
As
We don't need
long
to
as it doesn't reach the
Yeah.
point, it doesn't need to be cooled down. Yeah. So
Yes.
that thermal throttling does not occur at that point. Yeah.
Okay, thermal throttling. Thermal throttling is a temperature, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like a threshold.
Temperature, okay.
Yeah. Temperature threshold.
So like, for example, okay, let's give an intuitive example. So thermal throttling threshold here is like, for example, 51, right? So if we reach 51, we touch 51, we need to go directly down very soon, right?
Yeah.
If we keep it at 50, we can run that for a long time. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. But if we keep it running at 50, it still is going to hit the CPU, right? So it's going to be, the CPU will be, okay, if it's under that one, okay, we don't enforce you to going down. I mean, the heat can aggregate it, right? So still, if you,
I would say like thermal throttling is like the huge drop of performance that we would want to prevent sometimes. So if it's reaching the threshold, probably the CPU or GPU, they will lower the performance, but not that drastically in comparison to the thermal throttling. So I think the purpose of zero thermal throttling is to avoid such drastic downgrade of performance. Yeah.
okay. So I believe this is some IC design or protection design for CPU and GPU. If you reach the thermal throttling, it forces you to going down quickly.
Yeah, that's part of a protection for the CPU and GPU. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In that case, probably that makes sense. But do they show if we use a Mastral, how many times we reach the thermal throttling in their simulation figure experiment? Do they show that?
They do show about the zTT part of the.
No, do they show the comparison? For example, we use the zTT for one algorithm, we use the Mastral for the other algorithm. If we use this two algorithm, zTT, how many times it will reach the thermal throttling? For the Mastral, how many times they reach the thermal throttling? Do they show that?
They did not show the Mastral, as in, because Mastral pretty much they do just occur thermal throttling, but they do show a picture of the zTT on Jetson TX2 to be specific, and pretty much they never really reach they never really exceed the threshold point, and that is part of the results in the later slides.
Okay. Yeah, I got your point, but that's not convincing, right? Yeah, we know zTT probably never ever reached the thermal throttling, but how about Mastral? I mean, from the average power consumption and the performance, sometimes Mastral is better than the zTT, right? The only thing you can argue is probably Mastral is going to reach thermal throttling at certain times, but we don't know, right? If you don't show us, how can you convince us, your scheme is, your zTT scheme is better than the Mastral? I'm still stuck in that question. I'm not convinced. But could you go to the performance evaluation comparison again? performance, the YOLO and Aquarium zTT Maestro performance, that page. When you're still there, you're stuck.
Hello, sorry about the DC. I'm sorry, is it connecting now? Is it connecting now?
It's connecting. You can turn off your camera, then probably save some bandwidth, and you can share the slides.
Yeah, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that.
Yeah.
It-
I think we really have bad network connection on campus.
all right.
So I'm still not convinced by your explanation. I don't know why Maestro is worse than zTT, because you don't show me how many times Maestro reached thermal throttling, right? So
Yes.
if you think about the average power consumption and the performance here, they're similar. Anyway,
Yes.
you try to dig out the reason why, and if you can provide those answers in the group email, that would be good. Okay, we'll appreciate that.
Okay.
Continue, please.
Okay. Okay, so as for the different environments for the results, so here is the static environments for Pixel 3a. So this is the mobile device. So there are 3 applications, as in showroom, Skype, and the mobile game. And all those means that are normal zTT or fan zTT, normal Maestro fan rate. So it's another comparison between Maestro and zTT. So the temperature is the lower the better, and the frame rate is the higher the better. And in some cases of this, they don't have a really, I would say they don't really have a clear difference, but and as in like protective, in a protected case, or in like pocket, and when they're placed in pockets, zTT has a better performance than Maestro. So this is based on the static environments from the implementation.
I got a question for this picture too.
Yes.
Obviously, if you see the orange symbols, probably they can achieve better frame rate. But sometimes, most of the time, they have a higher CPU temperature too, right? So I don't know.
Yeah. I would say this is not as clear of an advantage as it should be. Like based on the results, this is not the because the results is that the result is like this. So I won't be saying that one really outperforms another, but in certain cases, and I would say overall, they have better performances in those cases.
Okay, let me ask a little bit more detail about these experiments.
Okay.
How many times they run the experiments? They take, I believe they take the average, right?
Yeah.
They just run one time and take the result.
They do like a average frame rate, so it's not just like once.
How many times they run the experiments? The reason why I ask this, for example, the Skype application, right? I mean, it's not only determined by the GPU, CPU scheduling. Sometimes it's determined by your network connection as well, just like your presentation, right? It's determined by the network connection. Sometimes network connection is good, right? You don't need to spend so much CPU temperature, or your probably connection time is less. But if sometimes the network is bad, probably is going to affect your performance too, right? So if you only do it once or twice, it doesn't mean anything. Supposedly, you should do that in the same environment for so many times, and you take the average and show the results. Oh, come on.
All right.
Continue, please.